at the University of Chicago, Raghuram Rajan. Thank you very much, sir, for joining
Thanks for
us.
having me.
Absolute pleasure to have you with us, especially at a time when there are so many headwinds that confront the Indian economy. So it's good to hear how you've been thinking about these. I want you to start by explaining to everyone watching at this time the real impact you think Donald Trump's tariff measures could have on the global economy and, most importantly, on India's growth.
Well, I think they are a big source of uncertainty and a potential source of disruption for the rest of the world. For the US, I don't think they'll be as beneficial as the administration thinks, partly because, goods are made outside the US for a reason. It's cheaper to make it outside. Trying to bring them back into the US by putting up tariffs, typically, if they could, they'd go somewhere else. What was being made in China will go to Vietnam. If you're going to put universal tariffs, maybe you stop them from coming in from elsewhere, but they have to be made in the US at a much higher cost because there's a reason China made it. I think the higher costs, the fact that the rest of the world is disrupted and their economies, which are already weaker than the US for the most part, weaken even further. And of course, the great uncertainty about where do you invest when tariffs could change overnight, not just from the US, because remember, there'll be retaliatory tariffs also. I think there's a big source of potential disruption in the world. I do think that the president has in mind three benefits. One, he believes it'll even the playing field. The US is running deficits because everyone else cheats. The second is that this could be a source of revenue. And the third is this could be a source of jobs. We could question each one of these, especially the source of revenue, because it's actually small in relative to the US economy's size. Maybe 200, 300 billion you'll get over time every year if you set them. But of course, firms will also make changes themselves. In terms of whether they'll create jobs, a lot of manufacturing is already automated, even in a country like India. Bring it back to the US, it gets even more automated. So I'm not sure this is going to create a lot of jobs, especially at the high school educated level, which is where there's a lot of anxiety. So
there is the question of competitiveness, which you say the United States doesn't have, which is why these jobs moved outside. But then there is also the aspect of economic coercion. Might is right. Donald Trump wills it, and we're already seeing how corporate America is trying to kiss the ring, as it were. And therefore, does that then impact India's opportunity to be the China plus one gateway, whereas a lot of companies think, hey, Donald Trump is calling us, cajoling us, coercing us, so it's better to set up manufacturing in the United States than to look at countries like India?
I think it creates uncertainty because, one of the things that President Trump respects is the market. Mm-hmm. If the market starts tanking on the basis of, some preliminary set of tariffs, then clearly there will be a revisit to the tariff proposition.
How are the markets likely to react in your view?
I think if you said, suddenly after the markets had been expecting no or moderate tariffs, 60% tariffs on China, 25% on the rest of the world, it would be seriously adverse for the markets. I think that is partly why the decision has been postponed some. Of course, we heard today it may come on February 1st for Canada and Mexico. Also, the other concern is there's a lot of other stuff wrapped up in these tariffs, right? Remember when the BRICS countries were talking about an alternative payment system, there was a threat of tariffs if you do that. The threat of tariffs if you have too many drugs being produced in your country and sent across. If you have immigrants, at some point the world is also going to get a little jaded. But of course, this is the most powerful country in the world. So you don't want to upset the president. You want to be on their right side. But how much can you do? So at some point, countries are also going to say the only thing they will listen to is the same kind of medicine. So you'll have tariffs imposed from the other side. Canada apparently has already prepared some. This is not going to end well if it continues along this path.
What kind of inflation pressures could it create on consumers in the United States and the spiral effect on consumers in India if these new tariffs are actually imposed?
Well, I think from the Indian perspective, it would be more limited because we don't import that much from the United States. And even if we impose tariffs on the US, that's not going to be a huge problem. I think the concern for India will be more if Chinese goods get stopped at the US border, will they try and find a home elsewhere? And similarly for Mexican goods and so on. I think on the US itself, tariffs will increase the price in the market. Some of it will be absorbed by the producer, but some of it will be passed on. If it is a one-time thing, I think the Fed will look through it because it's a one-time increase in prices. But if it's steady, if it creates more inefficiencies, that creates more inflation. If, work because they're protected from competition from the rest of the world, those could be sources of more steady, higher inflation. So, yes, it's inflationary, but maybe one-off, and the Fed will look through it. But there could be a more sort of steady ramp-up in inflation, in which case the Fed has to be even more stay with higher interest rates for longer.
There's a big debate in India at this moment about whether the dip that we've seen in economic growth in the second quarter of this fiscal, is it a short-term phenomena caused by the elections, caused by the pullback in capex because of the general elections, or is this more cyclical? Where do you come out on this deeply contentious debate? Short-term with an immediate recovery, or more cyclical and structural?
Well, one quarter it's very hard to be assured that you have the right answer. But for some time, I have worried about the strength of consumption, which has been less than normal over the last year and a half, 2 years. What has instead compensated is infrastructure spending, which undoubtedly the government has done a lot of, which has been very successful in elevating growth rates. But of course, what was missing last quarter? It was infrastructure spending. And so you could see that, when that's taken off, the economy is weaker than we thought it was. The other component that's important to focus on is earlier the weakness was in the lower middle class consumption and the consumption of the poor. Now you're seeing upper middle class consumption slow down somewhat. So my sense is, broadly speaking, what is the reason for consumption slowing, especially when the stock market till recently was quite buoyant? It has to be concerns about economic future, which means things like jobs. Do we have reasonable jobs? Are our children getting well employed? Do we feel confident enough about the future to spend? And you can see a lot of spending was being supported by borrowing, the unsecured borrowing that the RBI cracked down on. So these are all signs that at the edges, all is not well. Now, that doesn't mean we plummet in terms of growth. I still think our baseline is about 6. But 6 is not enough because we're not creating the jobs for those young people coming in.
India's growth numbers demonstrate the dependence on government capital expenditure. We've been waiting for private investment to kickstart. Capacity utilization has been in the mid-70s, which is typically when you see a fresh investment cycle kickstart. It hasn't happened fully so far, even though the likes of Neelkant Mishra and others say they can see some green shoots. What's your reading? Will we see a full-fledged investment cycle? Why is it being delayed? When does it start?
It's been delayed for a long time, right? I mean, when I was governor 8 years ago, I used to worry about why isn't investment coming back on. And there too, we were flirting with the 70, 75. We said, when it hits 75, it's going to come in. Didn't quite come in. That's, I think, the big puzzle. Why is private industry not investing? Partly, partly the answer is positive. It's because they've become more productive, they're using their capital better, etc. But partly the answer is negative, that they're not sure of strong demand going forward and not preparing in time. Because you would think if they see demand down the line, they should be preparing well in advance, and they don't seem to be. So it is a big source of worry. It would be nice if that came on board. Maybe part of the worry is with Indian exports also, that with the tariff situation. But of course, the tariff situation is more post-US election. But I do think this is a really big concern and a puzzle. I don't have a quick answer to why they're not doing it.
the fact that it's a puzzle is something for me to say. You're supposed to have the answers. If you
I
were,
don't
say, in Finance Ministry or RBI dealing with this situation where capacity utilization has been in the mid-70s, despite the reduction in corporate taxes, private investment hasn't really kick-started in a big way except for some green shoots in some sectors. What are your policy recommendations? How can we change that?
So, as you know, investment is a lot about animal spirits. It's about the sense of ebullience, the confidence that private industry has about the future, and also involves a certain amount of risk taking. I don't quite know if demand will be there, but let me invest. And in fact, what happens is you get a virtuous circle. Because they invest, because they create jobs, there's a sense of confidence that permeates the economy and they invest. I would say early 2000s, in the previous NDA government, you saw that confidence building up. When you talk to private industry, it was, we can beat the world. I don't sense the same kind of confidence anymore. It's no longer we can beat the world, but we need protection against all those guys who have, they have supports from the government, etc. We're talking again of industrial policy. We've talked about the PLI scheme before, but we need crutches. And that wasn't the case in the early 2000s. So it seems to me that part of the answer is private industry itself hasn't got that confidence to go out and invest, which it needs. Now, I don't know if it's tax cuts. We've, as you said, already cut the tax rate on private corporations quite a bit. I don't know if it's investment incentives, but it has to be more a sense that we can be world beaters. And that's disappeared for some reason.
Is there any way that can be changed? Because a lot of it is just spirits, right? You said animal spirits. Can any policy or nudge impact that?
No. I think you can talk a good game as a politician and say we're going to grow, but I mean these are hard-bitten business people, and unless they see the underpinnings, or they have this animal spirits from somewhere, it's going to be very hard to get them to put their money in the ground. So I think the government was doing what it could on the physical capital side, that is infrastructure spending. I wonder, and I've been saying this again and again, whether we can do more on the human capital side. That is, take, the fact that right now I was meeting a NGO here. He was saying, we've got all these bright kids, really poor kids. We identified them. They're really smart, but they can't get into the IITs. They can't get into the tech colleges. So we have a thin layer of very good schools, very good universities. Can we expand that? Because that's where we're getting our longer term sort of the people who are going to these GCCs, the people who are going to top, who are creating new jobs. So maybe it's to shift the focus of government spending. We talked about skilling in the last budget. I'd love to see how we're doing there, but we need to do far more.
Some analysts have spoken about the possibility of bringing in a reduction in income tax rates as a means of creating more consumption, that this is the right opportune time. Would you recommend to Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman that come the 1st of February, one of the things she should do to spur demand is to reduce income tax?
It's not so much the tax rate I would worry about. See, I think our fiscal situation, though the government has spent a lot of time trying to keep it on track, is not that sound. World over fiscal situations have deteriorated, but when our nominal growth is where it is, our debt starts becoming an issue with the kind of combined government and state and central fiscal deficit. Right now those numbers are very comparable, how much growth we have in the economy and how much our fiscal deficit is, which means that without we don't have much room to expand spending without seeing debt grow much faster than we want. So I would say at this point it's not so much on cutting taxes as on spending in a more effective way. And when we spend on a more effective way, I would say that focusing on increasing the quality of our human capital at every level, whether it's the health of our children, reducing malnutrition, or improving the quality of primary schools, improving the quality of our universities. I think across the board, if we invest, we have a chance in the new economy of the future. If we don't invest, I think we're going to reach the point where we want to be a developed country without the human capital to do it. We may have reasonable infrastructure, but we need human capital, people of high caliber. With 1.4 billion people, that has to be our most important asset.
When we spoke last, the biggest concern was around rural consumption. Now there's a lot of talk about urban distress. In fact, some analysts have spoken about the middle class shrinking. Some FMCG CEOs have spoken about it. You've got fund houses speaking about the great Indian middle class shrinking. Your reading of the data around the spirits of the middle class and whether the middle class numbers and their consumption actually coming down?
It's so again, I say, you know, a good time in the Indian economy was the early 2000s, when we saw a lot of reforms, but we also saw strong growth, but also spirits were strong. If you look at applications to the IAS, to the civil services, they were falling at that time. More recently, you see it going up significantly, and then you hear these horror stories about how many people applying for, you know, low-level railway jobs with PhDs and with MBAs and so on. I think that what we really are seeing is a lot of angst about job creation, good jobs, not any faltu job, but good jobs. And I think that unless we sort of match that, both in terms of, you know, it can't all be government. The government only has a limited number of jobs on its own. But even facilitating private sector jobs, what it can do is create the backbone for more jobs to be created. Take tourism, very employment intensive. Can we do more to facilitate tourism? Just visas. I mean, my friend from China, yes, he is from China, but he's an academic from Stanford. Why doesn't he get a visa to come in? Let's look at these nitty-gritty things. We want people to come from across the world to spend money in India. But you can take sector after sector. Plumbing. It's hard to find a good plumber in a city in India, a reliable plumber. Can we train more people up in that? I think we can grow jobs. We have to accept that they aren't all going to be IAS, but they can be pretty good jobs.
One of the government's big ideas has been production-linked incentives, and we spoke about it the last time we had a conversation. It's been a mixed track record. In some sectors, for example, like mobile manufacturing, solar panels, we've seen some positives because of the PLI schemes. But on balance, what's your reading of the efficacy of PLIs when it comes to job creation?
Well, I think what has happened is in a bunch of industries which are very capital intensive, we haven't seen much job creation. And, you know, where we've put enormous subsidies at play, for example, chips, I would say there's more of a concern that this is about national security than about creating a flourishing chip industry and creating jobs. I mean, chips are very capital intensive, not going to create many jobs. But even when you look at cell phones and you look at...
Do you think that's a bad idea?
I think the kind of investment we're doing in manufacturing chips, we're already designing chips. Should we put more money into creating more chip designers, where a lot of value added is? NVIDIA is worth over 3 trillion. TSMC, which makes the most highest value added chips, is about 750 billion on a good day. I mean, these are comparisons, apples and oranges, but broadly speaking, manufacturing is not where the value added is. It's in the design, the intellectual property, the all that kind of stuff. That's where we have people who can actually, you know, if trained up, make a difference. You know, I saw a number that we have 300,000 chip designers. We don't have a single chip manufacturing unit as yet. Should we be putting more value into chip design and maybe create our own version of NVIDIA, hopefully eventually?
It's about, I spoke to Ashwini Vaishnav about this, and the minister's argument is it's about building a full ecosystem, and also the fact that there is so much global uncertainty. We've seen the kind of norms the United States has come out with recently under President Biden. We're seeing how China is pushing against Taiwan, and the dependence on companies like NVIDIA, dependence on companies like TSMC. So you have to start somewhere in the government's argument and build an ecosystem, even if the chips being produced are far bigger and more outdated technologically than being, you can't get to the cutting edge right away.
Right. So the issue is, time and place to make that kind of investment, right? Right now, I think the real issue is, do we have enough capability to train our people to the levels that are needed? You know, we're building these chip factories. We can't get the engineers to actually construct them. We're going to get them from outside. But broadly, I would even disagree with the idea that we need the entire ecosystem in India. You know, ASML makes machines for chips in Netherlands. There's no big chip manufacturer in the Netherlands. That's the kind of specialization that is required in the world economy to be at the frontier. You can be the best machine maker in the world without having a chip industry. You can be the best foundry, as in Taiwan, but you don't have to have a chip designing this in framework. The chip designers are all in the US. Can we build a chip design industry because our human capital is available? But let's invest more in our human capital. That would be my argument to something like we need the ecosystem. That said, I'm saying don't prevent any manufacturing, but think carefully when you're putting so much money in terms of subsidies, because we're competing with the US, we're competing with Taiwan, those guys are going to create a glut in chips sooner rather than later. Why not buy the chips when they create the glut? Yes, I understand there's a security rationale. By all means, to the extent that we need some of those chips for our military, let us buy them, create inventories, create surpluses. That'll be far cheaper than trying to make them.
In the last budget, the government came out with employment-linked incentives. Yeah. 1 year down, how do you see that play out? Should Nirmala Sitharaman double down on ELIs, or is that not working out the way the government would have wanted?
I think the broader issue of bringing people into work and training them on the job is extremely important, given we need jobs in any way we can get. And I think that was a good idea. I think the skilling announcements that were made then are also good ideas. What I would love to see is careful monitoring of where we are and how it's working. And this is not Press Information Bureau giving us some numbers which God only knows where they came from, but put out the numbers. Let people do research on it. Say, here is where we're doing well, here's where we're not doing so well. A modern economy needs to run on the basis of careful data analysis. And we're not even getting the data, let alone the analysis. I think if we are to do these things well, I mean, remember we had a whole Skill India, this thing, which didn't really take off because a lot of people apparently were funded to actually do it, but the outcomes weren't that great. We need to measure outcomes.
There's now an internship scheme with the big NSE listed companies. Yeah. Do you think that's a good idea which they should build on?
I think all ideas are good until they're proven bad. Let's try it out. We, as I said, we need all the jobs we can. Let's try it out, but measure what happens. Just because you went into Hindustan Lever or L&T doesn't necessarily mean that you're employable if the course you got was terrible. On the other hand, you can go to a small entity and get a variety of experiences which make you very employable. So can we just measure? Are you employed 2 years? We have the data. We can find the data. Do you pay income taxes 2 years from when you were trained? What is your job? What are you doing? Just track it.
There's a new governor at the RBI. The Indian rupee has been depreciating. The last governor's thinking seems to have been to hold off on the depreciation. The new governor seems to have a slightly different thinking. What do you see as being the medium-term outlook for the rupee? To what extent should the rupee be allowed to depreciate, especially given the potential for a political backlash against the central government?
So, I think we have to be a lot more mature about the rupee-dollar exchange rate than the public dialogue sometimes seems to be. First, if the dollar is appreciating vis-a-vis the euro, to hold it from appreciating vis-a-vis the rupee means that then we become uncompetitive in our exports to the euro or to anywhere else which is depreciating. So what you need to look at is across the basket of currencies how we're doing. And my sense is pretty much every country has depreciated against the dollar. We haven't appreciated or depreciated against other currencies, but we have against the dollar. Now, since everybody's looking at the dollar, we look like we're doing badly, but if you look at the euro, it's closing on parity with respect to the dollar, which means quite a bit of decline over the last year. I won't worry too much. The exchange rate is a means for the economy to adjust to things like tariffs, things like the fact that capital is flowing into the US. So don't overreact to the rupee dollar.
So what would be a natural exchange rate for the Indian rupee versus the dollar at this moment from your...
I don't want to put a number out there and say, no, I don't want to put a number and say, if we're not there. I think the RBI does these calculations, but others can also do it. What is the real effective exchange rate that we feel comfortable with? Which means taking into account in both the depreciation but also the inflation rate in the in India versus the rest of the world. I don't think we should hold the rupee at a level which is unsustainable. That just means wasting our foreign exchange reserves, and we will need it at some point if things become more difficult in the global economy. So I would say, do what the RBI has always been doing, which is focus on reducing volatility, but don't try and determine what the level is. Let it move towards whatever level it has to move to keep the economy in balance.
But I must press you because you're dodging my question.
I am, because I don't know the answer to that.
No, but if you don't know the answer, who knows the answer? If it is to be meaningful, there's been some commentary about letting the rupee slide to 100 rupees to a dollar, that being a more natural exchange rate at this moment, given what's happening globally.
I would not think that, from what I know, I don't think 100 is the right place. I don't know exactly what is. What I would look at is, which I haven't done, look at the weighted exchange rate against other currencies as well as our inflation, and make sure the real effective exchange rate hasn't crept up. That would make us uncompetitive. It coming down too much would make it more competitive, but would create the potential for some kind of volatility down the line. So I would say reasonable balance is to keep it fairly reasonable until tariffs hit. When tariffs start being imposed, if they're imposed against India, one of the answers is to let the rupee depreciate some.
The other question is about interest rates and the RBI's position on whether there should be a reduction or should it be held off. How would you view this question?
So I have never commented on RBI's monetary policy. I just commented, peripherally on exchange rates. Look, I think the RBI has a inflation targeting regime. It has to feel comfortable that inflation is coming down, and then it can cut rates. I think the economy, right? The problem, to some extent, is not supply. We seem to have reasonable supply. You can see that in the core inflation numbers. They have been, going at very moderate rates. The issue seems to be more demand. Now, of course, inflation has been high because of food, especially vegetables. I understand that's coming down. That may give the RBI more room, but clearly what it has to do is, keeping in mind the state of the economy, adjust monetary policy rates accordingly.
And what can be done to spur demand? There's a big budget, there's a monetary policy review as well. How should policymakers be spurring demand?
So again, this goes back to, is it something short term or is it something longer term? I think it's this confidence, not just in the industrialists, which we talked about earlier, it's also in people, in their futures. And politicians can make you feel, things are great. But if their daily lives aren't matching that, then they're going to cut back. I think you need to give them a greater sense that they will have better jobs, they will have better incomes. Then you will see the consumption pick up. So that's why I'm saying this is not a temporary thing. I think we've seen it exposed because of the fact that infrastructure came down this time, and we focused on the growth numbers. But consumption has been more tepid in relative to the past in the recent I would say even post-pandemic, and that would suggest something has broken, and that, to my sense, is household confidence. Which the way to repair it is to do much more on the job front, which is why I think the skilling, the apprenticeship, the trying to get incentives for job creation, all those are good.
Thomas Piketty has spoken about the need for a wealth tax of 2% on the ultra-rich in India. Do you think at this stage in India's economic journey that's a good idea? Because a lot of people are pushing back, saying these wealth tax haven't worked elsewhere and that Piketty is completely wrong.
Well, I think Piketty has been right about growing inequality across the world. Whether that's fixed through a huge, or even a wealth tax. Part of the problem is the very rich also know how to get around taxes. So, it's very hard to see any place where wealth taxes get you much. There's a wealth tax in the US, 45% of your wealth, once it's beyond 20 million. Why aren't these billionaires unhappy? Why aren't they trying to change it? Because nobody is really going to be hit by it. They've put it into various trusts, this, that. There's a whole lot of lawyering that goes on, which ensures that the ultimate wealth tax that will be collected will be tiny. So, I think it may be a reasonable idea to collect more in taxes from wealthier people to try and generate more growth by the various spending that has to take place. But I'm not sure that wealth taxes will do it for you. And as far as other income taxes are, we're pretty high already.
There's been a trend of high net worth individuals leaving India to go to Dubai, the United Kingdom and elsewhere. What would you recommend be done to try and change that? Why do you think that's happening, and can the government do something to try and change that?
Well, I haven't. That's another issue that I should study more. What you hear is, people are trying to establish multiple areas of residence and wealth so that they're more diversified against policy change wherever it happens. I don't know how big this is as a factor driving them, but I would try and create more incentives to bring money into India. So one of the big issues, I hear from business people, is the ease of doing business, right? We've talked a lot about it in India, but again and again you hear horror stories of, a tiny business easy to open. Once it's a big business, then I attract all the Inspector Raj, the tax authorities. Everybody's intent on making my life miserable. It's hard running a business in India even today, despite the government's sort of focus on ease of doing business. Can we make it easier so that you say, oh, look, there's all that demand that needs to be satisfied. Let me invest and let me create more job opportunities for people. So I do think we need to create an environment which attracts investment, whether it be domestic or foreign. Domestic, as you just said, could go out of the country if we're not careful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Motorola Razr 50 Ultra comes with Google Gemini.
आ तो गए, जाओगे कैसे?
हेलो, मैं आ रहा हूँ, भगा कर ले जाऊंगा।
सिक्योरिटी, भाग गए, पकड़ो उनको। हेलो,
बोला था ना, भगा कर ले जाऊंगा।
एक हिंट तो देते?
हिंट?
बड़े आराम से।
I don't read the news. I read between the lines to tell you the true version of events. The true story of our times.
To document grief, the toughest assignment for any journalist to be.
From those who matter.
Women politicians going to stick up for each other.
Of those who should matter. I document the truth. I don't distort the truth. I don't glamorize the truth. I don't gloss over the truth.
The ghosts of India's contentious medieval history have come knocking again.
I hustle for the truth. On the ground, in the newsroom, in the studio. I don't try to grab eyeballs.
I inform you to make you see the point.
To the Point with Preeti Chaudhary. At these times, only on India Today.
Hoja Rangila Re, with Motorola's incredible range of smartphones.
Hello, Moto.
Motorola Razr 50 Ultra comes with Google Gemini.
Hi, I am AI anchor Sana, bringing the top headlines for you, presented by Motorola. Arvind Kejriwal hits back at BJP, calls BJP's manifesto dangerous for Delhi. Bengal government moves High Court in Ajikar case, seeks death penalty for Sanjay Roy. Relief to Congress MP Imran Pratap Gadi in provocative song case. Supreme Court issues notice to Gujarat government.
The poll bugle has sounded. Small state, big heart and bigger political dividends. This is no ordinary election. Delhi doesn't just vote, it challenges. It questions.
Delhi living in a literal virtual gas chamber.
It decides the narrative for the nation.
We are the only revenue surplus government in the country.
As the battle unfolds on the 5th and the verdict echoes on the 8th, we're here to bring it all to you. This is State of War Delhi.
To talk about the impact that American President Donald Trump's economic policies and his new trade tariffs could have on India and the rest of the world, we're joined at the India Today Business Today studios at the World Economic Forum by one of the world's leading economists, the first Deputy Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Dr. Geeta Gopinath. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to have you. I want to start by asking you about what you're making of American President Donald Trump's determination to impose new trade tariffs. From the IMF's lens and from your own personal point of view, how do you see that pan out in actuality, belligerence versus reality?
Rahul, always a pleasure to join you. President Trump said he would hit the ground running, and he has done that, and he's announced a lot of measures. He's been more concrete on immigration and on energy, on tariffs, on trade policy more generally. He has pointed to intent, but we have yet to see what exactly he will do. The details matter, and the reason I'm saying that is because if you look at the tariffs that were done in 2018-19, the details didn't matter in terms of what products you put your tariffs on. That's going to determine how much of an inflationary effect it will have. How countries retaliate, that was absolutely critical for what the consequences were going to be. But, in general, what we have seen based on historical evidence is that if we end up in a place where there are lots of tit-for-tat tariffs that happen, then that's a net negative for the world as a whole.
So how much of an impact do you think this could have on global growth? It will, of course, determine, as you say, it will be determined by what tariffs he imposes, yes, what countermeasures the other countries employ. But how do you see this impact global growth? Because the latest IMF forecast seems to suggest global growth slowing down on its own even before these tariffs have come into place.
So in addition to knowing what the details are on the tariffs, there are a lot of other policies that are being announced by the US government. So, for example, which they plan to do, which is to make the tax cuts permanent, to have more financial deregulation. There is a lot of positive sentiment. Foreign direct investment into the US is very strong at this point. So all of that can have an offsetting effect. So in fact, our near-term assessment is that there are more upside risks to the US economy. Now, what that usually means is that if there's more growth in the US economy, it does have spillovers to the rest of the world, and that can be positive too. While many of the other policies on the trade front and so on will be more of a downside risk for the rest of the world. So what I'm trying to say is that it's not just about trade and tariff policy, but there's a lot that's happening on taxes, a lot that's happening on immigration, on energy, and so on. So we have to look at the sum total to be able to say what will happen to global growth.
President Trump has called India tariff king and threatened tariffs against India as well. How do you see that impact the India-America bilateral trade and India's growth and India's desire to build its own economy at this time?
This is going to be an environment where, the U.S. is going to have bilateral negotiations with all their trading partners to address what they feel are unfair trade practices, that the fact that their products get imposed higher tariffs than what the U.S. imposes on products coming out of other countries. And so, there is a valid point of whether this is a level playing field or not, and therefore I think countries will have to negotiate this. I mean, as you know, and I've said this before to you too, I mean, our view at the IMF is that India could afford to cut back on some of its tariffs just for its own sake, because this is an important opportunity for India to plug itself into global supply chains. Everybody is looking to diversify, and I hear from almost everyone that India is a very attractive destination. But to be able to go in, you will need somewhat lower tariffs in India too. So that will help India directly. Again, but like I said, every country is going to be negotiating this.
So there are two trends playing out simultaneously. One, India trying to attract some of the China plus one investment into the Make in India story. The other, Donald Trump, determined to get companies to invest and manufacture in the United States. To what extent could that mar India's chances? You're saying reduce tariffs, plug into global supply chains, but you've also got America determined to pull manufacturing into mainland United States.
But the US is actually quite successful now in being able to attract investment into the US. So if you look at foreign direct investment around the world, the US is an incredibly attractive destination. It's taking a bigger share of foreign direct investment flows. I think the best thing for India to do to offset some of that is actually to focus on the domestic reforms. In terms of what prevents people from going into India, it is about still, the ease of doing business, the infrastructure, the ability to buy land or sell land, contract enforcement. Those are the kinds of aspects that are more of a constraining factor. So the more India can do in terms of structural reforms at home, and it's done a lot. I mean, not to deny that, it's done quite a bit, especially in terms of public infrastructure. It's done a lot, and to keep that momentum going, that will be what will change the story for India.
You're talking about the need for the Indian government to usher in a new range of reforms. We've got a big budget coming up, and this is one year where there are just 2 elections in the states, and they're very far spread out. So it's an actual opportunity to push some reform through. On the economic policy, what are the key reforms you and the IMF are looking out for from India?
So I think firstly, it is important to continue on the path of public infrastructure investment. And implementation needs to be timely. This is not just at the central government level, but I'm talking at the state government level. There is still a big need for that, and so pushing more on that front is going to be important. It's also important to keep India's macro stability, and it's done very well in terms of inflation, and what the RBI has done in terms of managing inflation has done a really great job. On the fiscal front, of course, India's debt levels are high. It's not an imminent concern, but that's something in terms of the budget to determine what you can do, because you need to be able to raise some revenues too while you undertake the spending. Making sure that's done in a growth-friendly manner is going to be important.
India has seen a slowdown in economic growth in the second quarter of this financial year, with growth slowing to 5.2%. Overall, annual growth forecasts are down as well. Now there's a big debate raging over whether this is a temporary slowdown caused by the elections, by the pullback in capex, by the government, or is this more cyclical? How do you come out on this debate?
So the 5.2% we see as a temporary thing. That reflects the fact that there have been some delays in implementing some of the public infrastructure projects, but we see that picking up. And we do continue to see strength in rural consumption. I remember last time we talked about that. For the fiscal year as a whole, our growth number is 6.5%. So we do expect to see a recovery. But for us, potential growth is also at 6.5%. So again, this comes back to, if you want to be able to raise potential growth by a lot more, you're going to have to do the structural reforms.
So you've reduced what you think is India's potential growth in the medium term to about the mid 6%, right?
6.5%. Yeah, but I don't think we've been that far off from 6.5% in general.
Talking about cryptocurrency, I remember speaking with you last time, and you generally weren't very bullish on cryptocurrency. Now you've got a president of the United States who's highly bullish himself. Does that change? Apart from having coins in his own name and his wife's name, which is a different matter altogether, but does that change your perspective on how you're viewing cryptocurrencies and the stability and the future of this asset?
The way that we've always viewed it is that crypto has both risks and opportunities. There is a technology that's underlying it in terms of distributed ledger technology that many companies are actually using for other purposes, like for their payment platforms, for having more security in their contracts. That is all extremely welcome, and that's why innovation is good. There are many faces of innovation, and this is all fine. But at the same time, there are risks, and therefore we do think countries around the world need a solid crypto policy framework that protects consumers, that prevents your financial stability risks from building up. you can have both, and you have to hit the sweet spot there.
Speaking of regulation, there's a need for regulation on artificial intelligence as well. Do you see anything at all which leads the world towards having some kind of a common governance architecture, or will it just be the case of development and use cases running far faster than any governance around it?
First of all, for AI, it's much more than just regulation, right? There are issues of what would governments do if, in case AI ends up with a lot of people losing their jobs. How do you get also innovation going? What kinds of policies will encourage innovation? So it's not just about the regulation aspect, but there are multiple aspects.
So let's break it down one by one.
Yeah.
You spoke about the potential impact of artificial intelligence on jobs. I was just in a conversation at the World Economic Forum on industries in the intelligent age, and the argument being made by chief executives is that the impact on jobs isn't as severe as was being made out initially. How do you view this? How bad or how much of an impact will artificial intelligence have on jobs, particularly in India?
I think we haven't seen the first of it at this point. It's still early days. So we're still in the realm of the hypothetical and the theoretical at this point, based on some estimates that one can do.
What are your estimates?
Our estimates is for the world as a whole, 40% of jobs are exposed to AI, but at about half of that, so 20%, will benefit from AI, and 20% can be displaced. But there's a wide variation. So advanced economies are at 60% exposure. India is at 26% exposure. So there's a lot of variation over here. We'll see what happens in terms of the labor market. I think a good thing to remember from past history is that when you actually see the impact of automation on the job market is in the first year of a recession. So you don't see it in normal times, you don't see it in good times, everybody's chugging along. And then you have a recession, and then in that first year, that's when 90% of automation-related job losses happen. So I don't think we should be sanguine at this point. We should be careful what may come in the future. What governments can do first is to make sure that they're on the benefiting from AI side. That requires digital public infrastructure, skilling, making sure your population can actually use AI. Otherwise, they will be on the losing end.
So let's spend some time talking about that, because India seems to have taken on the mantle of being the use case capital of the world. Instead of focusing on building large language models of its own, it is attempting to do that, but really trying to implement artificial intelligence and its capabilities. Do you think that's the right approach? How would you, because you're also of Indian origin, how would you think a country and an economy like India should really be approaching artificial intelligence?
I think that's a good place for India to be. It does not necessarily have to be in the foundational models producing side. There are a ton that can be done in terms of application, and especially for a country like India, even in education, in the healthcare space, these applications can be very helpful, and they have to be tailored to country circumstances, which is why the industry has an advantage in doing that. But I mean, the bottom line is, as long as you have the right environment for companies to innovate, venture capital is going to be very important. The right level of skilled labor is going to be very important. Education is going to be very important. Creating that ecosystem is critical.
How strong a pushback do you see from China on some of the trade measures that the United States may implement, and how should India be navigating its dealing with the Chinese economy just at this moment? Because after a lot of deadlock along the line of actual control, there's ultimately now a bit of a thaw, and the question is, at what speed do you accelerate that?
Yeah. I mean, countries, for their own selfish interests, benefit from cooperating, and therefore I expect all countries are going to sit across the table and negotiate what they think is good for their countries. And by the way, cooperation, as I said, has been good for the world and for everybody individually. So we'll see how this plays out. I mean, the last time China did retaliate when the US imposed tariffs. We'll see what happens. It's too early to speculate.
But do you see the fragmentation of the global economy, the division into two camps, that trend accentuate? Or do you think they're more likely to find ways of being able to navigate these divisions?
We are already seeing signs of what we call geoeconomic fragmentation, which is when you look at trade is much more stronger between countries that are more geopolitically aligned. Geopolitical alliance is becoming a bigger factor in explaining who trades with whom, who invests in which country. So we are already seeing the seeds of that. And I expect that's going to continue. Now, unlike 50 years ago when so-called non-aligned countries were a very small share of world GDP. They're much stronger now. I mean, India, Mexico, all of them are much bigger economies, and they can play a much bigger role in terms of being a bigger part of the global supply chain and seeing how trade gets rerouted.
So do you see a fragmentation in the medium term of the world into two trading blocks?
I don't think I would point to a very stark break in terms of completely fragmented world, but we certainly have drifted away from the strong rules-based multilateral trading system that we've been used to for a couple of decades.
Before I end, I want you to, speak to young people who are watching you at this moment and wondering what kind of skills should they be developing to be able to navigate, succeed, and survive in a world dominated by artificial intelligence where machines are much smarter than men. How should they be preparing for the job market given the realities that face them?
Well, I mean, firstly, I still believe that STEM will be important. I don't think machines are going to completely take over all aspects of STEM. So STEM will remain important, but also just in terms of investing in creativity, in terms of investing in teamwork, in terms of thinking at a much higher level as opposed to in terms of the minutiae. I think all of that, building those skills is going to be important.
There's a big debate raging over immigration. Ultimately it seemed that Donald Trump came out on the side of Elon Musk on the issue of H-1B visas, but do you see this argument impacting skilled labor wanting to move to a country like the United States, or not really, that the pull is just too much and it won't impact who comes and who doesn't?
For many countries, including the US, there is certainly a need to revisit immigration policy. It has created a lot of stress in the US, and so it's not unusual to see that they are thinking of how to change the system. We remain of the view that skilled labor is critical for economies in the world, and if you can get the best talent from other parts of the world, you should attract that into your economy.
The American president talks about taking over Greenland. He talks about Canada as being a 51st state, and talking about taking over the Panama Canal. How do you see that potentially play out in the months to come?
Oh, that's not something I can talk to. I think we stay out of of those kinds of issues. We'll see what, if any, economic impact that it could have.
Well, it's been absolutely fantastic having you here, and thank you very much. I hope you have a superb World Economic Forum. Thank you.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you.
जाओगे कैसे?
हेलो, मैं आ रहा हूँ, भगा कर ले जाऊंगा।
सिक्योरिटी, भाग गए, पकड़ो उनको।